The rain fell in heavy sheets across the old stone bridge as 32-year-old Michael Torres hurried through the storm, carrying his 3-year-old son Tommy wrapped in a red blanket. Michael had been walking home from his second job at the all-night diner. Exhausted from another 18-hour day of trying to make ends meet as a single father. The rent was due tomorrow, and despite working 2 jobs, he was still $50 short. As Michael approached the center of the bridge, the dim street lights illuminated a figure standing dangerously close to the railing. Through the rain, he could see a young woman in a light-colored dress, her long hair soaked and clinging to her shoulders as she stared down at the dark water below. Michael's heart immediately jumped with alarm. He had seen enough desperation in his own life to recognize it in others, and every instinct told him that this woman was in serious trouble. "Tommy, hold tight to Daddy," Michael whispered to his son, then called out through the rain. "Hey, miss, are you all right?" The woman turned toward him, and Michael could see tear-streaked cheeks and eyes filled with a pain that looked as deep as the river below. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, and despite her obvious distress, there was something about her bearing that suggested she came from a very different world than his own. "Please just go away," she called back, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I do not want anyone to get involved." Michael moved closer, still holding Tommy securely. I'm sorry, but I cannot do that. My name is Michael and this is my son Tommy." "What is your name?" The woman hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to be left alone and being touched by the genuine concern in Michael's voice. "I am Isabella," she said finally. "Isabella, I do not know what has brought you to this bridge tonight, but I know that whatever it is not worth ending your life." Michael said gently. "Trust me, I have been in some pretty dark places myself." Isabella laughed bitterly. "You have no idea what my life is like. You cannot possibly understand." Michael adjusted Tommy in his arms, feeling the weight of his own struggles, but recognizing that this moment was about something much more important than his own problems. "Maybe you are right that I do not understand your specific situation, but I understand what it feels like to think that there is no way forward." "How could you possibly understand?" Isabella demanded, though Michael could hear that her anger was really directed at her circumstances rather than at him. Michael took a deep breath, knowing that sometimes the most important conversations require complete honesty. 6 months ago, after my wife left us and I lost my first job, I stood on this very same bridge wondering if Tommy would be better off without me. I thought maybe he would be better off in foster care than with a father who could not even keep a roof over his head. Isabella's expression softened slightly as she processed what Michael was telling her. "What stopped you?" she asked quietly. Michael looked down at Tommy, who was watching this exchange with the serious attention that children bring to adult conversations they do not fully understand but sense are important. This little guy did. I realized that no matter how bad things got, he needed his dad. Not a perfect dad, not a rich dad, just his dad who would never stop fighting for him. "But what if you are the reason people get hurt?" Isabella asked, her voice breaking. "What if everything you touch turns into disaster?" Michael could see that Isabella was carrying guilt about something specific, some burden that had brought her to this desperate point. "Isabella, I do not know what has happened in your life, but I know that everyone makes mistakes. The question is not whether we make mistakes, but whether we learn from them and try to do better." Tommy, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up in his small, clear voice, "Lady, are you sad?" Isabella looked at this innocent child with his blonde curls and concerned expression, and something in her heart cracked open. "Yes, sweetie, I am very sad. When I am sad, Daddy hugs me and tells me stories until I feel better," Tommy said with the simple wisdom that children sometimes offer. "Maybe Daddy could tell you a story, too." Michael felt tears mix with the raindrops on his cheeks as he realized that his son was trying to help this stranger the same way Michael helped him through difficult moments. "Isabella," Michael said, extending his hand toward her. "Please step back from the railing. Whatever has happened, whatever mistakes you think you have made, they do not have to define the rest of your life." For a long moment, Isabella stared at Michael's outstretched hand. Here was a man who was clearly struggling himself, carrying a small child through a storm, yet willing to risk his own safety to help a complete stranger. The contrast between his selfless concern and her own self-destructive despair was overwhelming. Slowly, Isabella reached out and took Michael's hand, allowing him to help her step back to safety. As soon as she was away from the railing, she collapsed against the bridge wall, sobbing with a mixture of relief and continued anguish. Michael sat down beside her, still holding Tommy, and waited for her tears to subside. "Isabella, do you have somewhere safe to go tonight?" Isabella wiped her eyes and looked at this good Samaritan who had saved her life. "I have been staying in a hotel, but I do not think I should be alone right now. There is a 24-hour coffee shop 2 blocks from here," Michael suggested. "Why do not we get out of this rain and talk? Sometimes it helps to share what is bothering you with someone who has no judgment about your situation." An hour later, they sat in the warm, bright coffee shop while Tommy slept peacefully in the booth beside Michael. Isabella had finally begun to share her story, and Michael was learning that his instincts about her background had been correct. Isabella was the daughter of Richard Hawthorne, one of the wealthiest men in the state. She had been raised in luxury, but had always felt pressure to live up to impossible expectations. 6 months earlier, she had made a series of business decisions for her father's company that had resulted in significant financial losses and the layoff of hundreds of employees. "I cost people their jobs, Michael," Isabella said, her voice filled with self-ramation. "Families lost their income because of my mistakes. My father barely speaks to me anymore, and I feel like everyone would be better off if I just disappeared." Michael listened carefully, then leaned forward with the same gentle directness he used when helping Tommy work through his problems. "Isabella, making mistakes in business is not the same as being a bad person, and running away from the problem definitely will not help the families who were affected." "What do you mean?" Isabella asked. "I mean that instead of punishing yourself, maybe you should focus on finding ways to help the people who were hurt by your decisions," Michael suggested. "You come from a family with resources. There have to be ways to create opportunities for those workers to help them get back on their feet." Isabella stared at Michael with surprise. "You really think there is a way to fix this?" Michael smiled, thinking about all the times he had felt hopeless about his own situation, only to discover that there was always another option if he was willing to work for it. "Isabella, I think that people who care enough to feel guilty about their mistakes are exactly the kind of people who can figure out how to make things right." Over the following weeks, Isabella took Michael's advice to heart. Instead of hiding from her father and the consequences of her decisions, she developed a comprehensive plan to help the displaced workers. She used her trust fund to establish a job training program, partnered with other companies to create new employment opportunities, and personally reached out to every family that had been affected. But Isabella's transformation went beyond just addressing her business mistakes. Her encounter with Michael and Tommy had shown her what real courage looked like. The kind of bravery that comes from facing each day's challenges with love and determination rather than wealth and privilege. 6 months after that rainy night on the bridge, Isabella visited Michael at the garage where he had found steady work as a mechanic. She had been instrumental in helping him get the job through her family's connections, though she had done so quietly without expecting recognition. "Michael," Isabella said as she watched him work on a car engine while Tommy played nearby, "I wanted to thank you for saving my life, but not just in the way you might think." Michael looked up from the engine, wiping his hands on a rag. "What do you mean? You did not just pull me back from that bridge," Isabella explained. "You showed me that the most important measure of a person is not how much money they have or how few mistakes they make, but how willing they are to help others even when they are struggling themselves." Tommy ran over and hugged Isabella's legs, having grown fond of this kind lady who visited them regularly and always brought interesting books and toys. "Miss Isabella, are you still sad?" Tommy asked with the concern that had first touched her heart that night on the bridge. Isabella picked Tommy up and hugged him tightly. "No, sweetie, I am not sad anymore. Your daddy taught me that when you help other people feel better, you feel better, too." 2 years later, at the grand opening of the Hawthorne Torres Community Center, a facility that provided job training, child care, and educational programs for working families, Michael stood with Isabella and Tommy as they cut the ribbon together. Center had been Isabella's idea, but she had insisted that Michael be her partner in the project. His understanding of what working families actually needed had been essential in designing programs that would make a real difference in people's lives. "You know," Isabella said to Michael as they watched families touring the new facility, "that night on the bridge, I thought my life was over, but it turned out to be the night my real life began." Michael smiled, watching Tommy play with other children in the Scents playground. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is help someone. I'll see that tomorrow can be different from today. Isabella nodded, thinking about how a struggling single father's willingness to reach out to a stranger had created ripple effects that had improved hundreds of lives. And sometimes the people who save us are the ones who need saving themselves, as they stood together watching their community center serve the families it had been designed to help. Both Michael and Isabella understood that the bridge that had once represented an ending had become the foundation for a new beginning. Not just for Isabella, but for everyone whose life had been touched by one man's decision to say, "Do not jump to a stranger in the rain."